Hey guys, tonight I want to pull back a curtain that has been hanging in place for over 150 years. Not because what is behind it is dark, not because anyone lied, but because the story most of us know, the one about the little house, the wagon, the fiddle in the firelight, left out an entire architecture, a hidden structure, built deliberately and carefully, in 28 months, in the frozen timber country of Wisconsin. 3 weddings, 2 families, one web so tight that the children it produced were not ordinary cousins. They were genetically as close to each other as half-siblings. And almost nobody who loves Little House on the Prairie has ever heard this story told straight. Let me tell it to you tonight. Close your eyes for just a moment. Picture the Wisconsin you have never seen in any television show. Not rolling farmland, not golden wheat fields stretching to a comfortable horizon. This is the Wisconsin of the 1850s. Heavily forested, half wild, with stands of timber so thick that full daylight barely reached the ground in summer. Dirt roads that became mud rivers every spring. Winters that arrived in October and did not release their grip until April. A land where the distance between one farmstead and the next could mean the difference between surviving a bad season and not surviving it at all. Into this world, 2 families had arrived. One named Ingalls, one named Quiner. They were not strangers. They were neighbours of the same kind. Old-stock Yankee Protestant families who had traced the same general road westward from New England and upstate New York, following the migration chain that poured settler families into the Great Lakes territories through the 1840s and 1850s. They likely worshipped in the same Protestant church, or close enough to one that it amounted to the same thing. They shared a county, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and by the mid-1850s, they were settled close enough to each other in the township of Concord that their fields practically touched. 2 families, same stock, same faith, same general economic situation. Farming people, serious people, people who understood that the land did not give you anything you did not take from it, with your hands and your labour and your years. By 1858, they were neighbours. By 1861, they would be the same family. Before we get to the weddings, we need to understand something that has been almost completely erased from the popular memory of Laura Ingalls Wilder's world. The image most of us carry is this: a small, courageous nuclear family, Pa, Ma, and the girls, alone on the frontier, loading up the wagon, moving west, facing blizzards and grasshopper plagues and failed crops and impossible winters, with nothing but their own virtue and their love for each other to hold them up. That image is real, genuinely real. The Ingalls family did all of those things, but that image is incomplete, because behind the nuclear family, woven into the structure of their world before Laura was ever born, was a kinship web that 3 specific marriages had built in 1859, 1860 and 1861. A web so precisely constructed that the children of all 3 married couples would share the same 4 grandparents. A web whose real purpose was not romance. It was survival. Here is what that means and why it matters. Imagine you are a farmer in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in the winter of 1858. You have a young family, you have cleared some land, you have a house, modest and cold in January, and a barn with a few animals in it. You have seed for next spring if nothing goes badly wrong. You have your hands and your back and your determination. And you have almost nothing else. There is no hospital within a day's ride. There is no insurance company that will pay you if your barn burns or your animals die from disease. There is no bank that will cheerfully loan you enough money to survive a crop failure without demanding your land as collateral. There is no government program standing between a bad year and your family going hungry. There is no fire brigade. There is barely a reliable road. What you have, what the frontier offered as the only real safety net, was this: the people near you who were obligated to help when things went wrong. Not strangers, not occasional neighbours who might help and might not. People whose survival was tied to yours. People who could not afford to let you fail, because your failure would weaken them. People who showed up at barn raisings, shared seed when your stores ran low, took in your children when you or your wife was sick and couldn't manage, pulled their draft animals next to yours when the field was too heavy for one team. That was the kinship network. That was the frontier safety net. Not government, not charity, family. And the more strands of obligation you could build into that network, the stronger it became. Now hold that thought, because here is where it gets interesting. The most reliable way to create maximum kinship obligation between two neighbouring families was not simply to become friends. Friendships could cool, neighbours could move, even a single marriage between families, while it created real bonds, created a bond that could be weakened by distance or death or conflict. The most reliable way, the way that created the strongest, most durable, most reciprocally balanced kinship alliance possible, was to exchange siblings, not once, multiple times. If Family A gave a daughter to Family B, and Family B gave a daughter to Family A, each family had both given and received. The obligation ran both directions. The bond was balanced, and the children those couples produced would share not one pair of grandparents, the way ordinary first cousins do, but all 4 pairs of grandparents simultaneously. Those children would be what modern genetic genealogy calls double first cousins. They would share approximately 25% of their DNA, not 12.5% like ordinary first cousins, 25%, the same genetic closeness as half-siblings, the same closeness as a grandparent and grandchild, 2 families, 3 marriages, all 4 grandparents shared across the next generation. The Quiners and the Ingalls figured this out in the frozen timber country of Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and in 28 months they executed it. Let us now put the actual people back into this story, because this is not an abstract genealogical exercise. These were real human beings, with real faces and real names, living in a real place that you can still drive to today. On the Ingalls side, we need to meet 3 people. The first is Polly Malona Ingalls, born October 14th, 1841, sister of Charles, sister of Peter, daughter of Lansford Whiting Ingalls and Laura Colby Ingalls. She is the Ingalls sibling who started everything, not by waiting for a Quiner brother to come calling, but by becoming the first half of the first pairing. Polly is, in almost every account of this story, the least discussed participant. History tends to focus on her famous brother and his even more famous daughter. But Polly was the genealogical anchor of the entire web. Without her marriage, the pattern could not have begun. The second is Charles Philip Ingalls, born January 10th, 1836, in Cuba, Allegheny County, New York, the third of 9 children of Lansford and Laura Ingalls. By 1858, he's 22 years old, living in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, a capable young farmer with restless eyes, and a fiddle he played at every opportunity. Most of the world knows him as Pa, but in the winter of 1858, he's just a young man in a cold county, sizing up his future. The third is Peter Riley Ingalls, born 1833, Charles's older brother, quieter in the historical record than Charles, because he did not have a daughter who grew up to become the most famous frontier author in American history. But Peter's marriage, the third strand of the web, the one that sealed everything, was the one that made the whole structure permanent. On the Quiner side, we need to meet 3 people as well. The first is Henry Odin Quiner, born 1835, Caroline Quiner's brother. He will be 23 years old when he walks into the Justice Court in Concord, Wisconsin, on February 15th, 1859, and marries Polly Ingalls. He is the one who started it, the first Quiner to reach across the few fields separating the 2 families and make the bond permanent. Henry Odin Quiner does not appear in any Little House book as a developed character. But what he did on that February morning set in motion a genealogical consequence that his niece Laura would live inside for the rest of her life. The second is Carolyn Lake Quiner, born December 12th, 1839, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Henry's younger sister, 20 years old when she marries Charles Ingalls on February 1st, 1860. The world knows her as Ma, the gentle, educated, steady presence in every Little House book, the woman who kept the household dignified through conditions that would have broken most people. But in the winter of 1860, she is simply a young woman completing the second strand of a family alliance that her brother had already begun, and that her sister Eliza would finish 18 months later. The third is Eliza Ann Quiner, born April 21st, 1842, in Brookfield Township, Waukesha County, Wisconsin, Caroline's younger sister. She married Peter Riley Ingalls on June 5th, 1861, in Watertown, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and in doing so drew the third golden thread through the web, the one that sealed two families into one permanent kinship structure. Eliza Ann Quiner Ingalls lived until 1931. She saw Laura's books published. She watched her niece, the child of the second marriage in the sequence, become famous across the entire world. What she thought about the fact that her own family, the double cousin web she helped complete in 1861, never appeared in those books is a question the surviving record does not answer. Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. The outline of this story, 3 marriages, 2 families, 28 months, is not hidden. It is in the county records. It is in the census data. It is in the genealogical databases where anyone who cares to look can find it. The Pioneer Girl annotations, published by the South Dakota Historical Society in 2014, document the web in plain scholarly language. And yet, if you asked 100 dedicated Little House readers what they knew about the Quiner Ingalls sibling exchange marriages, my guess is that fewer than 5 of them could tell you all 3 wedding dates, all 6 names, and what the genetic consequence was for the next generation. The books made it invisible, not through deception, through the particular alchemy of children's literature, which needs its families tight and its narratives clean. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote the version of her world that her readers could follow and love and remember, a version centered on the fire and the fiddle and Pa's voice in the dark. She wrote the warmth at the center. She left the architecture in the county records. Tonight, we are going back to the architecture. But before we lay out each of the 3 weddings in full, before we follow the golden thread from Polly and Henry's winter morning in 1859 through to Peter and Eliza's summer afternoon in 1861, let me give you the 3 things this story is really about. Because this is not just a genealogy lesson. First, this story is about survival, about what it actually meant to build a family on the frontier, not just in terms of courage and virtue, which the Little House books described beautifully, but in terms of cold strategy and shared labour, and the deliberate construction of the only safety net the 1850s offered. Second, this story is about genetics, about what it means, in practical terms, for a child to have double first cousins instead of ordinary ones. About the fact that Laura Ingalls Wilder grew up surrounded by people who shared 25% of her DNA, people she called cousins, who were as close to her genetically as half-siblings, and about why that specific degree of biological connection was not an accident. It was the product of a calculated family strategy. Third, this story is about narrative, about what happens when a real and richly complex family architecture gets transformed into a series of beloved children's books, about what gets simplified and what gets omitted. Not out of shame, not out of dishonesty, but out of the particular demands of storytelling. The need to make a world legible, lovable, and followable for a reader who has never stood in a frozen Wisconsin timber field trying to calculate how many more bad winters a family can absorb before something breaks. Laura wrote the part she could see most clearly. The web was the part she lived in, but never quite turned to look at directly. We're going to look at it directly tonight. But first, let me give you the web in its simplest possible form, so you can hold the whole structure in your mind as we walk through it together. On one side, the Ingalls family, a large Yankee Protestant farming family, originally from New England and upstate New York, settled by the mid-1850s in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. The parents, Lansford Whiting Ingalls and Laura Colby Ingalls, among their children Polly, Charles and Peter. On the other side, the Quiner family, a similar Yankee Protestant farming family, arrived in Wisconsin via Milwaukee. The parents, Henry Newcomb Quiner and Charlotte Tucker Quiner. Among their children, Henry, Carolyn and Eliza. 2 families, neighbouring farms, same county, same faith, same general world. Then, in the space of 28 months, Polly Ingalls married Henry Quiner, February 15th, 1859. Caroline Quiner married Charles Ingalls, February 15, 1860. Eliza Quiner married Peter Ingalls, June 5th, 1861. 3 marriages, 3 strands, 1 completed web, and every child born to any of those 3 couples, every child, would share the same 4 grandparents, Lansford and Laura Ingalls on one side, Henry and Charlotte Quiner on the other. Laura Ingalls Wilder was born on February 7th, 1867. 6 years after the web was sealed, she was not just a child of Pa and Ma, she was a child of the web. She was born into a kinship structure that had been carefully and deliberately built before she drew her first breath. She grew up inside it, and she almost never wrote about it. That's chapter 1. Before we go further, and we have 6 more chapters ahead of us tonight, each one going deeper into a different part of this story, let me tell you what is coming. Chapter 2 is going to take us inside those 2 Wisconsin families before the weddings happened, what their worlds looked like, what survival actually demanded of them, and how 2 neighbouring families could come to the rational conclusion that marrying their siblings to each other 3 times in 3 years was not strange at all. It was, by the brutal logic of frontier life, almost obvious. Chapter 3 walks you into each of the 3 weddings individually, Polly and Henry's winter morning, Charles and Caroline's precisely 1 year later, Peter and Eliza's summer afternoon in 1861, and explains, strand by strand, how the web was constructed. Chapter 4 goes into the genetics. What double first cousinhood actually means, in numbers and in lived experience. Why Laura's cousins were as genetically close to her as half-siblings, and what that felt like in the texture of daily frontier life. Chapter 5 examines what happened to the web after it was built, how the same frontier forces that made it necessary also worked, over time, to scatter it geographically. Chapter 6 takes you into the books themselves, what Laura wrote about her double first cousins, what she left out, and why the gap between the county records and the published Little House narrative is one of the most revealing silences in American children's literature. And Chapter 7 asks the question that sits under all of it. What does American frontier memory lose when it smooths a triple-strand kinship web into a single clean story about a nuclear family alone on the prairie? And what does it mean that a girl built by a web became famous for writing about being alone? Now, we have 6 more chapters ahead of us. The archive is deep. The story is richer than the books. Think about what it actually took to survive a Wisconsin winter in 1858. Not the romantic version, not the firelight and fiddle version, the real version, where a single bad decision in October could mean your children were hungry by February, where a broken leg on a timber clearing job could leave your wife alone with 3 young children, and nobody within a day's ride who was obligated to care whether you lived or died. That was the world the Quiners and the Ingalls were living in when they decided, almost simultaneously, to do something that looked like love but functioned like architecture. And before you can understand the web they built, you have to understand what they were building it against. Yes, the Wisconsin that most people picture when they hear Little House in the Big Woods is gentler than the historical truth. It is cozy, it is amber-lit. There is a warm hearth, and Pa's fiddle is playing, and the family is safe inside the circle of their own goodness. That image is earned. Laura built it carefully, from real memory. But step outside that circle for a moment. Step outside the firelight and into the actual timber country of Jefferson County, Wisconsin in the 1850s. What you find is not cozy. It is heavy, dark and demanding in ways that modern life has almost no equivalent for. The forests were immense. Old-growth timber, white pine, oak, maple, so dense in places that a team of oxen working full days could clear an acre a week if the ground cooperated and the weather held. Every farm began as a fight. You did not inherit cleared fields in frontier Wisconsin. You created them, stump by stump, season by season, with nothing but hand tools and muscle and the knowledge that the ground you cleared this year was the ground that would feed your children the year after. That kind of farming required labour at a scale that a single nuclear family, 2 adults, and whatever children were old enough to lift a tool, could not always reliably supply. And here is the thing that the frontier history books sometimes understate, because labour statistics are not as compelling as blizzard stories. Labour was the currency, more important than money, more important than luck, more important in many situations than the quality of your land. A family with enough hands to get the harvest in before the first frost ate that winter, a family that ran short of hands, because of illness, accident, death, or just the hard arithmetic of a young couple with babies too small to work, was a family that might not. The medical situation made this worse. There was no hospital in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in 1858. The nearest doctor might be a day's travel away, and a day's travel in mud season on frontier roads meant something different than it means to us now. Childbirth killed women. farm accidents killed men. Childhood diseases, typhoid, scarlet fever, whooping cough, moved through frontier households without the slightest respect for how hard a family had worked or how much they deserved to be left alone. A frontier family in this world was always, at any given moment, one calamity away from a crisis it could not manage alone. Not because they were weak, not because they were foolish, because the margin was simply that thin. Now, hold that picture. The cleared fields and the uncleared ones, the short-handed harvests, the sick child in the middle of a work week, the woman in difficult labour with no trained help within reach, the man with a broken wrist in the middle of planting season. Hold that picture and ask yourself a simple question. What is the single most valuable thing another family could give you in that world? Not money. Money was scarce and often useless when what you needed was a warm body showing up in your field at the right moment. Not good intentions. Good intentions from a stranger across the county did not get your hay in before the rain. What you needed was obligation. Specifically, the kind of obligation that ran deep enough that the other family could not look away when things went wrong. The kind of obligation that made ignoring your crisis feel like abandoning a member of their own blood, because through the right kind of marriage, that is exactly what you would be. That kind of obligation had a name in 19th century frontier communities. It was called family. Both the Ingalls family and the Quiner family had arrived in Wisconsin Territory via the same migration corridor, the long Atlantic pipeline that moved Yankee Protestant farming families from New England and upstate New York westward through the Great Lakes territories throughout the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. The Ingalls line traced back through New England, the family's roots running through the kind of literate, congregationalist farming culture that produced careful parents, diligent children, and a deep cultural belief that land ownership was the foundation of everything respectable. Charles's parents, Lansford Whiting Ingalls and Laura Colby Ingalls, had made their way into the upper Midwest as part of this same westward flow. By the mid-1850s, they were settled in the township of Concord in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, with their children arranged around them, Polly, Charles, Peter, and the others. The Quiner family had followed a similar road, though arriving slightly differently. Caroline Quiner, the woman who would become Ma, had been born in 1839 in Milwaukee, which tells you that her family was already in Wisconsin Territory during its early settlement phase. Her parents, Henry Newcomb Quiner and Charlotte Tucker Quiner, had brought their children, Henry, Caroline, Eliza, and the others, into the same cultural and geographic world that the Ingalls family inhabited. Same county, same Protestant faith, same material conditions, same understand of what hard winters demanded. There was two families, same stock, same county, neighbouring farms. But here is where it gets interesting, because neighbouring in frontier Wisconsin meant something very different from what it means in a modern suburb. Neighbouring in Concord Township in the 1850s meant you might see the other family at church on Sunday. You might encounter them at a barn raising, or at the mill, or on the road into town. You might have borrowed their ox team once when yours went lame, and offered labour in return. You knew their faces, their reputations, their general situation. You knew whether their barn was in good shape, and whether their fields were well tended, and whether the man of the house was the kind of person who showed up when he said he would. This kind of sustained, low-level, mutual observation process was, in a frontier community without formal background checks, the primary mechanism of social trust. And the Quiners and the Ingalls, by 1858, had clearly observed each other carefully enough to conclude that what they saw was worth binding to permanently. But here is the question underneath the question. Why 3 marriages? Why not 1? Why not 2? A single marriage between the two families would have created a bond. Real, meaningful, legally recognised, and socially valuable. Henry Quiner marrying Polly Ingalls in February 1859 would have connected two families in a way that carried genuine mutual obligation. So why did it not stop there? The answer is about the mathematics of vulnerability. A single marriage creates what frontier families understood as a single strand of kinship. That strand is strong as long as both partners are alive and the families remain on speaking terms. But it can be broken. A death, a severe estrangement, a geographic separation. Any of these could weaken or sever a single-strand bond. 2 marriages between the same families double the number of strands, harder to break. More channels of obligation, more angles of mutual dependence. If one strand weakens, the other holds. 3 marriages create something qualitatively different from 3 separate strands. They create a web, a structure where the 2 family nodes are connected by multiple overlapping threads, and where each additional connection reinforces all the others. Break one strand of a web, and the web holds. The structure is designed for exactly the kind of stresses that the frontier routinely applied to human relationships: distance, disaster, death, and time. There is one more element to this architecture that is easy to miss if you are thinking about it purely in economic terms. The triple marriage was not only about labour and crisis response. It was about something subtler, the distribution of social risk. In the 1850s frontier world, a marriage between 2 families always involved an implicit asymmetry. One family was giving away a child, one family was receiving. In a single marriage arrangement, this asymmetry could create a kind of social debt, or at least a social question, about whether the trade had been fair. The sibling exchange resolved this. When Henry Quiner married Polly Ingalls, the Quiners gave, and the Ingalls received. When Charles Ingalls married Caroline Quiner a year later, the Ingalls gave, and the Quiners received. When Peter Ingalls married Eliza Quiner 18 months after that, the Ingalls gave again, and the Quiners received again. By the end of those 28 months, both families had given, and both families had received. The obligation ran in both directions with exactly the same force. Neither family could look at the other and feel they had given more than they had gotten. That symmetry was not an accident, it was a feature of the design. Now, before we go any further into the architecture, there is something specific about these 2 families that deserves your attention. Both families were what 19th century demographers would call old stock Yankee Protestant Americans. British descent, Protestant faith, likely Congregationalist or similar evangelical tradition, literate, farming-oriented, and deeply invested in land ownership as the primary mechanism of family security and social standing. This shared cultural background was not incidental to the marriage sequence. It was a prerequisite. Frontier communities in the 1850s were, in some respects, surprisingly cosmopolitan. German and Scandinavian immigrant families were also settling Jefferson County and surrounding Wisconsin counties during this same period, but the social circles within which marriage partners were typically selected were drawn tightly within cultural and religious boundaries. A Congregationalist Yankee farming family would, in the normal course of events, identify marriage partners from within the same cultural orbit. The Quiners and the Ingalls were already in each other's orbit before any wedding was planned. Same church, or close enough. Same general farming culture, same migration story, same set of assumptions about what a reliable family looked like and what it owed its neighbours. Here is what that meant in practice. By the time Henry Quiner stood up in Jefferson County on February 15th, 1859, and took Polly Ingalls as his wife, the 2 families had already spent years doing the kind of quiet, sustained mutual evaluation that the frontier demanded before any irreversible commitment. They had watched each other work. They had seen each other's fields in good years and bad. They had observed, with the focused attention of people whose lives depended on accurate character assessment, whether the other family was the kind of family that showed up, and by 1858, both families had apparently concluded the same thing about the other. They were. That conclusion, that quiet, years-long assessment, is the thing that the marriage records cannot fully tell you. The Jefferson County Marriage Register records the dates: February 15th, 1859, February 1st, 1860, June 5th, 1861. Names, witnesses, location. The dry administrative residue of what were, in their human reality, the culmination of a long, careful process of mutual recognition between 2 families who understood, in the bone-deep way that frontier people understood things, what they needed and where they might find it. But what was it specifically that made these 2 families the right partners for each other? Consider what each family brought to the table. The Ingalls side offered something that the frontier specifically valued: proven sons who could clear, build, farm, and function. Charles Ingalls, who would later become Laura's pa, was, by all documented accounts, a genuinely capable man, a skilled carpenter, a competent farmer, a fiddle player, which mattered socially in a frontier community where entertainment was homemade, and a man who could play at a barn raising was a man people were genuinely glad to know. Peter, his older brother, was cut from similar cloth, steady, capable, a man who knew how to work land and maintain the kind of sustained effort that frontier farming demanded over years, not just days. And then there was Polly, Charles and Peter's sister, the one whose marriage started everything. Polly Ingalls is, in almost every popular telling of this story, a background figure. She does not appear in the Little House books as a developed character. Her name does not carry the cultural weight that Laura's or Caroline's does. But understand what she represented in the structure of this alliance. She was the Ingalls family's offer to the Quiner family. She was the opening bid, the gesture of good faith that said we are willing to give as well as receive. Without Polly's willingness to marry Henry Quiner, the symmetrical exchange that made the web possible could not have been initiated. On the Quiner side, the family offered something equally specific and valuable. Henry Quiner was a capable young man, a reliable farmer and builder in his own right. But the deeper value the Quiner family brought was a set of women who were educated, practical, and equipped to manage frontier households under conditions that would have defeated people without genuine competence. Caroline Quiner, the future May, had received more formal schooling than many frontier women of her generation. She was literate, precise, and capable of maintaining the kind of domestic order that made a frontier household genuinely functional, rather than merely survivable. Her sister Eliza possessed similar qualities. These were not ornamental accomplishments. On the frontier, a woman who could manage a household efficiently, who could preserve food correctly so it lasted the winter, keep children healthy through illness, maintain the basic record-keeping and planning that a small farm required, was a survival asset as real and measurable as an extra team of horses. And two capable families, compatible values, neighbouring land, shared faith, mutual observation over years. And then, in February of 1859, Henry Quiner decided to begin. He was 23 years old. Polly Ingalls was approximately 19. Neither of them, walking into that Jefferson County courthouse or church on February 15, 1859, was thinking consciously about kinship coefficients, or frontier survival strategy, or the web that their marriage was about to initiate. They were two young people in a cold Wisconsin winter, making the most fundamental human commitment available to them. But the conditions that shaped their choice, the isolation, the labour demands, the paper-thin margins, the intimate knowledge of each other's family that years of neighbouring had provided, those conditions were not romantic. They were architectural, and the architecture they were about to build would outlast all of them. Here is something the county register will not tell you, but the logic of the sequence will. Between February 1859, when Henry married Polly, and February 1860, when Charles would marry Caroline, something happened in the relationship between the two families. The first marriage worked, not just as a domestic arrangement, though presumably it did, but as a kinship bond, as a labour alliance, as a mutual observation experiment that had now extended into the most intimate possible terrain. Henry Quiner was living inside the Ingalls orbit now, or close enough to it that the two families were entangled in all the daily, practical, entirely undramatic ways that frontier kinship created. Shared harvests, shared animals, shared information about what was planting well this year and what was not. And Charles Ingalls, 22 years old, watching his sister's marriage to Henry Quiner with the quiet, calculating attention of a man who understood what family alliances meant, was observing Caroline Quiner with precisely the same kind of sustained, careful evaluation that the frontier demanded before any irreversible commitment. 1 year later, almost to the week, he would act on what he had seen. That is the world that made the web possible, not coincidence, not pure romance, though the human feelings involved were real and should not be dismissed. The marriages that would follow over the next 2 years grew from the same soil that grew everything else in Jefferson County in the 1850s. Hard work, careful observation, and the unspoken but absolute knowledge that in this world, without the right family around you, you were always one disaster away from being genuinely alone. But there is something I want you to hold on to as we move forward. Something that sits at the heart of this entire story and doesn't fully announce itself until much later. The web was built from real people, not from strategy documents, not from family councils sitting around a table drawing kinship diagrams. It was built from two ordinary families who looked at each other across a few snow-covered fields in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and recognized, in the slow, quiet, bone-sure way that frontier people recognize things that mattered, that what they were seeing was worth keeping close. The strategy was real, and the feeling was real, and the fact that you cannot fully separate one from the other is not a problem with the story. It is the story. Because here is the thing about the web that the genealogical databases and the DNA percentages and the county marriage registers cannot quite capture. When Henry Odin Quiner married Polly Ingalls on February 15th, 1859, he was not thinking about his future niece Laura's literary career. He was thinking about Polly, about the farm they would build, about the winters ahead, and when the Ingalls family watched that marriage happen, watched their sister Polly walk into a permanent bond with the Quiner boy, they were watching the first golden thread pull tight between two worlds that had been close for years but never, until that morning, permanently connected. Charles Ingalls was in that room, or near enough to it. And across the same room, or the same winter, or the same run of cold months in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, was Caroline Quiner, his future wife, the woman who would become Ma, the woman whose mother and father would become the shared grandparents of a generation of children who would grow up calling each other cousins while sharing half the DNA of siblings. She was watching too. What exactly she was thinking, what Charles saw in her and what she saw in him, in that specific year between the first wedding and the second, is something the historical record preserves only an outline. What we know is what happened next, and what happened next is where this story truly begins to earn its name. 3 weddings, 3 strands, a web so precisely woven that a girl born 6 years later would grow up surrounded by near siblings in neighbouring houses, and later write a series of books that almost entirely left that web off the page. 1 year after Henry and Polly stood up together in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, Charles Ingalls was ready, Caroline Quiner was ready, and the second strand was about to be drawn. Nobody walked into February thinking it would become a habit. That's the thing about the first wedding. It just looked like 2 young people in Wisconsin winter standing up in front of their families and making the most ordinary kind of promise that they would belong to each other from now on. Henry Quiner, Polly Ingalls, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, February 1859. And that was it. Except it wasn't. Henry Odin Quiner was somewhere in his early 20s when he married Polly Ingalls, the kind of young man that a frontier community recognised on sight. Capable, steady, the sort of person whose handshake was worth something, because he'd already shown people who he was in the particular way frontier communities revealed character, through work, through showing up, through the way a man held himself accountable when the circumstances gave him every excuse not to. Polly Ingalls was his sister's Polly, Charles and Peter's sister, the one who doesn't appear in the books, the one who's almost always the footnote in the footnote of this story. But pay attention to what Polly actually was inside the architecture of what was about to happen, because she was not a footnote, she was the anchor, she was the Ingalls family's gesture of trust. Before you can receive, you have to give, and the Ingalls family, by offering Polly, their daughter, their sister, their own blood, was saying something to the Quiner family that no words could have said as clearly. We are willing to bind ourselves to you permanently, not with a handshake, not with a business arrangement, with a person we love. That is what Polly's wedding meant, not romance. Not just romance anyway, it meant the first thread had been drawn. Now imagine you are Charles Ingalls standing somewhere near that February ceremony in 1859. He is 22 years old. His sister is getting married, which means the Quiner family is now permanently, irreversibly tangled into the Ingalls world. And across whatever room he is standing in, or across the months that would follow, the shared harvests and shared work and the kind of slow, sustained proximity that Jefferson County in the 1850s created between neighbouring families, who are now also family, is Caroline Quiner, 20 years old, born December 12, 1839, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Her brother Henry has just married Charles's sister Polly, which means Caroline already knows Charles Ingalls not as a stranger, but as someone she has watched carefully, the way frontier people watched each other, measuring everything that the record wouldn't preserve. How he handled difficulty, how he spoke to people who couldn't help him, what he was like in the in-between moments when nobody thought anyone was paying attention. She has had an entire year of that kind of watching, because the first wedding made it unavoidable. What Charles was doing during that same year, on his side, is not something the historical record preserves in detail. What it preserves is what he did next. February 1st, 1860. Almost exactly 1 year after Henry married Polly, Charles Philip Ingalls stood up in Concord, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and married Caroline Lake Quiner. He was 24 years old. She was 20. The date is one of the most securely documented facts in the entire Ingalls genealogical record, a Jefferson County marriage register entry that nobody has successfully disputed. And here is what I want you to sit with for a moment, because the calendar here is not a coincidence, or at least, it is too precise to dismiss as one year to nearly the week. Henry and Polly in February 1859, Charles and Caroline in February 1860. The two families had just completed one full rotation of seasons together as partial kin. One planting, one harvest, one winter, one slow thaw. And by the time that cycle completed, Charles Ingalls had apparently seen enough, decided enough, was ready to draw the second thread. But here's what that second wedding actually created that the first one could not. After Henry married Polly, the two families had a kinship bond. A real one, legally recognised, socially meaningful, carrying genuine mutual obligation. Henry Quiner was now Charles Ingalls' brother-in-law. The families were connected, but they were connected in one direction. When Charles married Caroline, the connection doubled, and it didn't just double in the way that two parallel lines double a single line. It crossed. Because now Charles Ingalls was both the brother of Henry Quiner's wife and the husband of Henry Quiner's sister, and Caroline was both the wife of Polly Ingalls' brother and the sister of Polly Ingalls' husband. The same two people were now aunt and uncle to each other's children, through two completely independent lines of descent. That's the moment the structure stopped being a bond and started becoming a web. A single thread can be cut. A crossed web holds even when one strand breaks, and the frontier, as both families understood from long cold experience, had a habit of breaking things. Think about what this second marriage meant in the daily reality of Jefferson County, Wisconsin in 1860. When Caroline Ingalls needed help with a difficult birth, the woman most obligated to come, by both love and by the ancient calculus of mutual kinship, was Polly, her sister-in-law, her husband's sister, also her brother's wife, two channels of obligation running simultaneously through the same person. When Charles's team of horses went lame in the middle of planting season, the man most likely to show up with a spare team was Henry Quiner, his sister's husband, also his wife's brother. Again, two channels, one person. This is what the crossed web produced in practical terms. Not sentiment, not warm family gatherings, though presumably those happened too. It produced redundant lines of obligation, backup channels, the frontier equivalent of a failsafe. But here is what I keep coming back to, every time I think about those two February dates lined up 1 year apart. Charles and Caroline were not running a strategic calculation with a ledger book open on the kitchen table. They were two people who had come to know each other in the specific, unavoidable way that frontier proximity and partial kinship created, and who had decided, in whatever private, unrecorded way that decisions like that get made, that they wanted to spend their lives together. The strategy was real, the feeling was real, and the web held both, woven together so tightly that a century and a half later, you still cannot pull them apart. It was just 18 months past, long enough for Henry and Polly to have their first child, long enough for Charles and Caroline to have settled into the rhythms of a shared life, long enough for a third young adult on the Quiner side, Eliza, Caroline's sister, to have watched two of her siblings marry into the Ingalls family and to have formed her own opinions about what that meant and whether it suited her, and long enough for Peter Ingalls, Charles's brother, to have made his own quiet assessment of Eliza Quiner. In June 1861, Peter Ingalls married Eliza Quiner in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, the third thread. And this is where the structure of what these two families had built finally revealed its full shape. Go back to the two family trees, Ingalls on one side, Quiner on the other. Now count the strands connecting them. 1. Henry Quiner to Polly Ingalls. 2. Charles Ingalls to Caroline Quiner. 3. Peter Ingalls to Eliza Quiner. 3 connections crossing between the same two nodes. Not a line, not even 2 parallel lines. A web. A structure with no single point of failure because the load was distributed across all 3 strands simultaneously. And the people on either end of those strands were no longer just neighbours. They were something that the 19th century didn't have precise language for, and that the 21st century, with its consumer DNA kits and its genealogical databases, is still working out how to explain. They were the parents of double first cousins. Here is the part that stops people cold when they first encounter it. Most of us grew up understanding first cousins as the children of a parent's sibling. Your aunt's kids, your uncle's kids. 2 families connected through one shared sibling pair, which means the cousins share 2 of their 4 grandparents, specifically the grandparents on the shared side. Modern genetic genealogy puts a number on it. Approximately 12.5% of shared DNA. That's regular first cousins. What the 3 Quiner Ingalls marriages created was something different. Take the children of Henry and Polly, Quiner children, Ingalls children at the same time. Their mother Polly was Charles Ingalls' sister, which means they shared the Ingalls grandparents with Laura, but their father Henry was Caroline Quiner's brother, which means they also shared the Quiner grandparents with Laura. Both sets, all 4. Not 2 grandparents in common, not 3. All 4 grandparents simultaneously, through 2 completely independent lines of descent. The genetic consequence of that double overlap is that those cousins shared approximately 25% of their DNA with Laura Ingalls Wilder, the same percentage as a half-sibling, the same coefficient of relationship as a grandparent and a grandchild. They called each other cousins. The biology said something closer to siblings. They were. And now sit with what that actually meant for a girl named Laura, born February 7th, 1867, into a world already shaped by those 3 marriages. She didn't grow up with abstract genealogical concepts. She grew up with people, faces, names. The particular way a cousin laughed or helped with a task or showed up at exactly the wrong moment to embarrass you in front of someone you were trying to impress. She grew up with children who shared all 4 of her grandparents. The Ingalls grandparents who produced her father, the Quiner grandparents who produced her mother, running through neighbouring households within the same general orbit as her own family. And she grew up apparently without finding this remarkable enough to explain in the books that would make her famous. Because the web was so woven into the fabric of her world that it didn't need explaining. It was just the way families worked, the way her family had always worked. The double cousins were simply there, as present and as ordinary as sisters, because in terms of shared blood, that is almost exactly what they were. What changed was the frontier. Not immediately, not all at once, but the same force that the web was built to resist, the frontier's appetite for scattering everything that stood still too long, would eventually begin to test those 3 threads in ways that the families could not have anticipated on those 3 February and June mornings in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. The 28 months between February 1859 and June 1861 had produced something remarkable. 2 family trees so thoroughly merged that their children would spend their whole lives carrying the biological fingerprint of all 4 of their shared grandparents, whether they ever understood that or not. The web was complete, triple-anchored, load-distributed, built for the worst the frontier could throw at it. What nobody in Jefferson County in June of 1861 knew yet, what nobody could have known, was that the worst was coming faster than anyone expected. And when it arrived, it would not come for the web. It would come for the man at the centre of it, the one who had drawn the second thread, the one who believed, with a conviction so deep it looked like faith, that the next place was always going to be the one where everything finally worked. Charles Ingalls was about to start moving, and when Pa started moving, the web was never quite the same again. Here is something nobody tells you about the frontier. It didn't just take things from families, it moved them, relocated them, picked up the entire life a family had carefully built, the habits, the neighbours, the buried babies, the smell of a particular kitchen, and dropped it somewhere else. And then, sometimes, it did it again, and then again, until the moving itself became the only constant, and the people who watched you leave started to wonder whether the problem was the land or the man. Charles Ingalls moved his family at least 9 times between 1869 and 1880. 9 times in 11 years. Let that settle for a moment, because the books made it feel like adventure. But stand inside it from Caroline's perspective, from Ma's perspective, and ask yourself what 9 moves actually meant. It meant 9 times packing what you owned into what could fit in a wagon. 9 times leaving the grave of someone you had buried nearby. 9 times starting from nothing in a place where nobody knew your children's names yet. And here, right here, is where the web the 3 marriages had built. That triple-anchored, load-bearing structure made of Henry and Polly, Charles and Caroline, Peter and Eliza, began to feel the weight it was designed to carry. Because Charles Ingalls moved, but Henry Quiner mostly didn't. By 1870, the United States federal census shows Charles Ingalls and his young family in Chariton County, Missouri, not Wisconsin anymore, not the Jefferson County ground where the 3 marriages had been solemnized, where all 6 newly bound members of the Quiner-Ingalls alliance had been neighbors close enough to borrow tools from and call on in a hard week. Missouri, 500 miles give or take from the cluster of people who shared every grandparent with his daughters. The distance was not simply geographic. Every mile Charles Ingalls put between his family and the Wisconsin kinship cluster was a mile subtracted from the daily, practical dividend that the web was supposed to pay. Remember what the web was built to do, not to create warm Christmas gatherings, but to produce redundant lines of obligation in a world where a single failed harvest could end everything. The crossed strands were supposed to mean that when Polly couldn't come, Eliza could. When Henry was too far away, Peter was still close. When you ran out of the thing you needed most, someone who shared your children's blood was near enough to notice before it became a crisis. That system required proximity, and Pa kept choosing distance. Here is the part that Caroline Ingalls never said out loud, at least not in anything the historical record preserved. She was the second strand of the web. Her marriage to Charles was the crossing point, the moment 2 parallel lines became a genuine structure. She was also Henry Quiner's sister, which meant that every time Charles loaded the wagon, she was leaving her brother and her brother's children, who were as genetically close to her daughters as half-siblings, a little further behind. Historians who have worked closely with the Pioneer Girl manuscript and with Caroline Fraser's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography Prairie Fires have noted that Ma's emotional interior is largely invisible to us, filtered through Laura's child's eye perspective and through the deliberate optimism of the published books. What we know about Caroline is mostly what she did, not what she felt. She packed, she unpacked, she kept the household functional on the edge of financial ruin, she taught her children to read, she stayed. But staying with Charles meant leaving everyone else. The move that most people know from the books, the one into Kansas Territory, into what the Ingalls family called Indian Territory, around 1869, was almost certainly not legal. The land Charles settled on in Montgomery County, Kansas, was within the Osage Diminished Reserve, and the family was squatting on land that had not yet been opened for homesteading by any legitimate federal process. This is not a small detail. This is the ledger, open to a page that the Little House books quietly turned back over. Pa had left a kinship web worth more than any single land claim. He had moved his family onto property he had no legal right to occupy, on the gamble that the federal government would eventually open the land and reward the settlers who had shown up early. It was a risk, and not the first kind of risk, not the kind where a man with a full barn behind him diversifies into new acres because he can afford to be wrong. It was the other kind. The kind where there is no cushion. The kind where being wrong means losing everything, including the year you already spent working that ground. The government did not open the land. The Ingalls were ordered out. They came back north, toward Wisconsin, though not all the way home. They settled near Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, Redwood County, Minnesota, and for a moment it looked like the risk calculus might finally resolve in their favor. It didn't. Plum Creek is where the grasshoppers came. In 1874, and again in 1875, the Rocky Mountain locust descended on Redwood County in swarms so thick they blocked out the light. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration handed down through family storytelling. Documented, recorded, historically confirmed swarms that stripped every green thing from the land in a matter of hours. Imagine spending a year building a crop from scratch. Your hands, your seed, your back, your entire forward financial position, and then watching it disappear in an afternoon. Not rot slowly, not fail gradually in ways that let you prepare. Disappear. Consumed, audibly, by a moving cloud of insects so dense that the sound of them was reported to carry for miles before they arrived. Pa had no full barn to fall back on. He had whatever Caroline had managed to preserve, whatever neighbours could spare, and the faith, still absolute, still uneroded by the accumulating evidence against it, that the next season would be different. It was not different in 1875. Meanwhile, and this is the part the books almost never bring you to, Henry Quiner and his family were not grasshopper farming in Minnesota. The documentary record for Henry Quiner's specific movements in the 1870s is thinner than the Ingalls record, partly because Henry never produced a famous daughter who later wrote books about him. But what the census and genealogical records suggest is that Henry's trajectory was considerably more stable than his brother-in-law's. He was not making 9 moves in 11 years. He was not farming on legally contested land in Kansas. He was not watching a locust swarm take his entire crop twice in consecutive summers. Henry Quiner had married Polly Ingalls, Charles's sister, in February 1859. He had drawn the first thread of the web, and then, by the evidence available, he had done something Charles could not quite seem to manage. He had stayed put long enough for stability to accumulate. This is not a character judgment. This is not a claim that Henry was a better man or a smarter one. The frontier was indiscriminate in the way it distributed hardship. What hit one family did not always hit the next, and much of what determined whether a family prospered or failed was simply timing, location, and the particular role of weather and market and insect migration that a given county happened to draw in a given year. But proximity matters, and whatever advantages Henry's relative stability provided, to Polly, to their children, to the double-cousin generation, those advantages were not available to Laura and her sisters when the wagon was in Kansas, or in Minnesota, or eventually in Dakota Territory. The web had been built for exactly this kind of pressure. 3 strands, crossed and load-bearing, specifically designed so that no single point of failure could bring the whole thing down. That was the logic behind the triple marriage sequence. The frontier instinct that said, bind tightly enough to people you trust, and you create something that survives the worst. But the web was also spatial. It worked across distance that a horse could cover in a day or two, not across state lines, not across half a continent. The doubled obligations, the cross-channels of aunt and uncle simultaneously that the 3 marriages had built, required the families to actually be reachable for those obligations to mean anything. And every time Pa pointed the wagon somewhere new, the web stretched a little further. At some point, a web that stretches far enough stops holding anything. At some point, it is just threads. Laura was born in 1867 into a family that had already begun to move. She was 2 years old when they went to Kansas. She was 7 when the grasshoppers came. She was 10 when they moved again, this time toward Burr Oak, Iowa, a period the book skipped almost entirely, historians believe, because the family's circumstances there were too grim, too economically exposed, too far from the pioneer myth to fit the story Laura eventually wanted to tell. She was growing up, chapter by chapter, in a family that the web was supposed to protect, but that kept moving out of the web's reach. She was also growing up watching her mother pack and unpack, with the particular quiet competence of a woman who had learned to not be surprised by the wagon appearing in the yard again. What Ma knew about stability, she had left behind in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. What she had instead was Charles. And Charles, brave, restless, absolutely certain that the next horizon was the one where everything finally worked, was already looking at a map of Dakota Territory. The grasshoppers were gone. The Plum Creek claim was behind them. The Ingalls family had survived again, barely in ways the ledger records, but the books don't quite show. And somewhere north of everything they'd already tried, the Dakota Prairie was waiting, wide open, unbroken, full of the particular dangerous promise that had been pulling Pa west his entire adult life. The web was about to stretch further than it had ever stretched before, and what happened next, in the frozen, beautiful, catastrophically exposed Dakota Territory, would test not just the Ingalls family's survival, but the thing Laura decided to do with the memory of all of it, decades later, when she finally sat down to write Here is something nobody tells you about the Little House books. Laura didn't write about being surrounded by family. She wrote about being alone, on the prairie, in the wind, just Pa and his fiddle and the wide, flat sky. And it worked. It worked so beautifully that generations of women grew up believing that was the whole truth. A small, brave family, bound by nothing but their own goodness and grit, carving a life out of frontier land by sheer force of love. But here's what the records show when you actually sit down with them. Laura was never as alone as those pages made you feel. She was born into the centre of something deliberately built, a web of marriages, obligations, and shared blood so precise and so calculated that historians who study 19th century frontier family strategy would look at it and nod slowly, the way you nod when you recognise a pattern you've seen before. Not in storybooks, in ledgers, in census returns, in the kind of paperwork that frontier families filed because paperwork was the thing you had left when everything else went wrong. The question this chapter is going to ask is a quiet one, but it doesn't let go once you hear it. If the web was real, if it was built on purpose, by people who understood exactly what isolation could do to a family, then why didn't it make it into the books? And what does it mean that it didn't? Hold that question. Hold it carefully. Because the answer is not simple, and it is not flattering to anyone, and it is not the answer that Laura Ingalls Wilder, sitting at her desk in Missouri in the 1930s, an old woman with aching hands and a lifetime of hard years behind her, would necessarily have wanted to write. Let's start with what the web actually looked like from the inside. Imagine you are a child, somewhere between 5 and 10 years old, growing up on the Wisconsin frontier in the late 1860s. You have a father and a mother and sisters. That much is true. That much matches the books exactly. But here is what the books compress into the soft word relatives. You also have an aunt who is your mother's sister, married to your father's brother. You have cousins who share every single grandparent you have, on both sides. You have a family structure where the adults around you are not just vaguely extended family. They're closer to you genetically than most people will ever be to any cousin in their lives. Biologists put a number on it. Approximately 25% shared DNA, the same as a half-sibling. That is not a footnote. That is the world Laura was actually born into, and that world had a purpose. Yet the frontier, in 1861, in 1867, in the years when the Quiner-Ingalls web was first being tested by real life, was not a romantic place. It was a practical problem. A daily, grinding, dangerous practical problem with no institutional solution. There was no insurance, not the way you know it. There was no FEMA. There was no hospital you could reach before a fever ran 3 days. There was no agricultural extension service to tell a young farmer that the seed he'd chosen was wrong for that soil, or that the summer was going to turn dry, or that the early frost was coming a full 6 weeks ahead of normal. What there was, the only reliable thing there was people you could call on. And the question of who you could call on, and whether they would actually come, and whether they were obligated enough to you that you could ask without shame, was not a soft social question. It was a survival question. The Quiner family understood this. The Ingalls family understood this. And when Henry Quiner married Polly Ingalls in February of 1859, and when Charles Ingalls married Caroline Quiner exactly a year later on February 1st, 1860, and when Peter Ingalls married Eliza Quiner in June of 1861, each of those marriages was not just a love story. Each one was another strand pulled tight in a structure designed to hold weight. 3 strands, 3 years, 2 families, fused so completely that their children would share all 4 grandparents. A web is hard to break. That is precisely the point. Now here is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, in that quiet way that the best true stories always do, because the web held, mostly. But the thing about a web built for frontier survival is that it can only protect you from the kinds of disasters frontier people anticipated. Crop failure, a bad winter, an illness that emptied one household's labour supply. Those were the threats the web was built to absorb, and for those threats, it worked. What it couldn't protect against was the kind of slow dispersal that the frontier itself demanded. Each new land opportunity, each new territory thrown open to homesteaders, each new railroad town that promised more than the last one, pulled families outward. the very restlessness that made the frontier possible, that made Pa Ingalls the kind of man who would pack a wagon in the middle of the night and go, was the same force that stretched the web thinner and thinner with each move. And Charles Ingalls moved a great deal. Historians who have traced his relocations describe a pattern that is uncomfortable to look at straight on, because it does not match the pioneer mythology of steady, purposeful building. He moved from Pepin County, Wisconsin to Montgomery County in Kansas. He moved back. He moved to Walnut Grove in Minnesota. He moved again, briefly to Burr Oak in Iowa, then back to Walnut Grove. And then he moved one more time, west, into Dakota Territory, to the small windscraped town of De Smet in Kingsbury County, which was not yet even a proper state when they arrived. Each move represented both a fresh start and a gamble made with almost nothing in reserve. Each move pulled the family a little further from the centre of the web. Think about what that means for the web's protective function. When the 3 Quiner Ingalls marriages were completed in 1861, both families were still close enough geographically that the alliance was a living, breathing, practical thing. A crisis in one household could bring the other households within reach. A bad harvest could be softened by a shared granary. An illness could be met with extra hands. But by the time Charles Ingalls was filing his homestead claim outside De Smet in the early 1880s, the web had been stretched across 5 states and nearly 2 decades. Henry Quiner's family was not next door. Peter Ingalls was not around the corner. The triple-strand structure that had been built to concentrate resources and labour in one geographic place was now a family tree scattered across a map. The safety net was still there, technically. Technically is a word that does the heaviest lifting in frontier history. And then came the winter of 1880 to 1881. If you have read The Long Winter, and most of the women who grew up on Laura's books have, and more than once, you know the bones of it. The snow starting early, the train stopping, the town of De Smet cut off from supplies for the better part of 7 months, the Ingalls family twisting hay into sticks to burn when the coal ran out, grinding wheat by hand in a small hand mill that lived in the corner of their kitchen, surviving on brown bread and determination while the blizzards came again and again and did not stop. Laura writes it as an act of pure family courage, and in a significant sense it was. No honest reader of that winter, the documented records of it match the book's account closely enough that historians do not dispute its basic shape, can read it without feeling something genuine about what those people endured. But here is the question that The Long Winter almost never invites you to ask. Why was the safety net so thin by then? The web had been built precisely to prevent a family from facing something like the winter of 1880 to 1881 alone. The triple bond, the shared grandparents, the double cousin network that was supposed to mean there was always another household that could send flour or coal or an extra pair of hands. Where was it? Partially it was geography. De Smet was far. The frontier had done its dispersal work, but partially it was something else, something that shows up not in the family's love for each other, which was real and documented, but in the structural decisions, particularly Pa's decisions, that had put them in De Smet in the first place, on a claim that had not yet proven itself, in a territory that was not yet a state, during a winter that no one in that region had ever seen before. Both things can be true. A man can love his family completely and still make choices that leave them exposed. The frontier was full of men exactly like this. The difference was not character. The difference was often what they started with. The Wilder farm in New York did not face anything like the winter of 1880 to 1881 in that kind of isolation. It is worth sitting with that sentence for a moment. The big barn in Burke, in northern New York, where Almanzo Wilder had grown up, the barn that a later chapter of his wife's books described with a child's awe, full of hay and harnesses and the warm breath of good horses. That barn represented something the Ingalls homestead outside De Smet did not have. Not just the physical barn, what the barn stood for. What it proved had accumulated behind it over years of farming well-established land, in a county with functional markets and roads, close enough to other Wilder holdings that one hard season did not mean a family's entire margin was gone. The Wilders had a cushion. The Ingalls, by 1880, did not. Here is something the Pioneer Girl manuscript, Laura's original unedited autobiography, published in its annotated scholarly form by the South Dakota Historical Society in 2014, makes quietly visible, if you know what you're looking for. The published Long Winter focuses tightly on the Ingalls family's endurance. Pa, Ma, the girls, the mill, the hay, the faith that spring would come. The Pioneer Girl contains references to a broader social world, neighbours, other families in De Smet, the texture of who else was there and how they were managing, the double cousin generation, the Quiner and Ingalls relatives whose existence had been the foundation of the whole web. They are not the heroes of that winter in the way the nuclear family is. The web had thinned. Laura does not editorialise about this. She was not writing a treatise on frontier economics. She was writing, first in the unedited manuscript and then in the polished books, from inside her own memory, and inside her own love for her father, which was genuine and deep and never wavered even when the ledger entries were bleak. But the gap between what the web was supposed to provide and what it could actually provide by the early 1880s, stretched thin by a decade of moves, is visible in the record if you are willing to look. And now we are close enough to the real question that it is time to name it directly. The Little House books gave America a story about frontier survival built on character, on goodness, on the kind of love that keeps a family together through every kind of darkness. And that story is true. It is true the way all the best myths are true. It captures something real about what those people were and what they valued and what they risked for each other. But the story that lives underneath it, in the census returns and the land records and the marriage registers of Jefferson County, Wisconsin, is a different kind of truth. That truth says, two families looked at the frontier and decided that love and goodness alone were not enough. That truth says, 3 weddings in 3 years were not just romance, they were architecture. That truth says, the web that held Laura's world together was not something that happened to her family. It was something her family built, deliberately, and with full understanding of what isolation could cost. And then one person, a restless, optimistic fiddle-playing man who believed with everything in him that the next piece of land would be the one that finally worked, kept moving away from the centre of it. Here is where the story turns. Because by the time Laura Ingalls was 17 years old, working as a schoolteacher on the Dakota Prairie to help pay for her sister Mary's tuition at the Iowa School for the Blind, a fact documented in the historical record and confirmed in the Pioneer Girl manuscript, she was already doing something interesting with the story of her own life. She was already deciding what it meant. A young woman who has grown up on repeated moves in dugouts and shanties and small frame houses on claims that didn't always hold, develops a particular relationship with the idea of stability. She sees what it costs to not have it. She sees it in her mother's face. She sees it in the way her father's optimism carries him forward, past the point where caution would have stopped another man. And she meets Almanzo Wilder, who drives a team of horses better than almost anyone she knows, who comes from a family in New York with a barn full of hay and a granary that didn't run dry, who is, though she does not frame it this way in anything she ever wrote publicly, a man with a different kind of starting position than the one she grew up in. That courtship and what it meant and what it did and did not change about the economic reality of Laura's adult life, that is where this story goes next. But before we get there, sit with this for just a moment. The web had been built to hold. 3 strands across 2 families, meant to create something strong enough to survive the frontier's worst. It held through a great deal. It stretched. It thinned at the edges. And in the winter of 1880 to 1881, while the blizzard stacked and the train stopped and the handmill turned and turned in the cold corner of the Ingalls house in De Smet, the question the records ask, quietly, without accusation, the way an old ledger asks questions just by having its numbers in a column, is whether the web might have held better if the man at the centre of it had stayed closer to its anchor. Whether risk, praised the same way for every frontier man, should mean the same thing when one man has a full barn behind him, and whether the story told to generations of children about what built a life on the American frontier left out the part where some families began with more to fall back on than others. That part is coming. There is a thing that happens to every family eventually. The thing is this. Life puts the exact kind of pressure on them that the family was built to survive, and in that moment, you find out whether what they built was real, or whether it was just a story they told each other on good days. The Quiner Ingalls web had been built, strand by strand, across 28 months, for one reason that no one ever said out loud at any of the 3 weddings. They didn't need to say it. Every person in that room understood it without language. You build the web because you know the winter is coming, not a season, a winter in the older sense, the kind that doesn't end with spring, the kind that takes something permanent. And by the 1860s, the winter was already at the door. What you need to understand, what the Little House books will eventually carry you past too quickly, in the warm amber glow of fiddle music and firelight, and a father who always seems to know what to do, is that the world the Quiner Ingalls web was designed to survive was not a gentle place. It was a place where you could do everything right and still lose, where a family that worked faithfully and prayed sincerely and planted carefully could watch the ground crack open beneath them anyway. The question was never whether hardship would come. The question was whether anyone would be standing beside you when it did. Here is what we know about the years immediately following June 1861, when Peter Ingalls and Eliza Quiner completed the triple bond and the web was finally whole. The web had been constructed inside the Wisconsin frontier, a world of timbered hillsides and cleared farmland and small settlements, still fragile enough that a single bad fever season could hollow out a neighborhood. But it wasn't built to stay in Wisconsin. The families who had made it were part of something larger and older and far more restless, the American habit of westward movement, the belief, not entirely wrong, not entirely right, that the next piece of land was always going to be the one that finally held. Charles and Carolyn Ingalls would carry that belief farther than any of the other Webb families. And what that movement cost them, measured against what the Webb was supposed to provide, is one of the quieter tragedies buried inside the cheerful pages of the books Laura eventually wrote. But that is a story for a moment that isn't here yet. Right now, in the early 1860s, the Webb is new. The children it was designed to protect have not yet been born. And in the particular brutal logic of frontier life, a family alliance is only as useful as its geography. You cannot borrow your double first cousin's draft horses if your double first cousin is 3 states away. That distance, the slow, grinding westward spread that would eventually pull the web apart at its seams, is the thing the books never quite name. Think about what the web was supposed to do, not in the abstract, in the specific and practical language of what life in 1861 Wisconsin actually demanded. A woman giving birth needed another woman nearby who knew what to do when things went wrong, and things went wrong often enough that knowing was not optional. A man felling timber for a house frame needed other men with their own axes and their own strength, because the logs were heavier than one family could lift and the winter didn't wait. A family whose wheat crop failed, and crops failed, regularly, without sentimentality, needed neighbours who had enough in their own cellar to share something, not because those neighbours were saints, but because they knew that next year the failure might be theirs. The web, in its most essential form, was a distributed survival mechanism. 3 households instead of 1. 3 sets of hands when the emergency arrived. 3 cellars that, in theory, in design, in the logic that built the thing, would not all be empty at the same time. The Ingalls grandparents, Lansford Whiting, Ingalls and Laura Colby Ingalls, Charles and Peter and Polly's parents, were the anchor generation, the elders around whom the grandchildren of the Webb would eventually gather, recognizing each other not as distant relations but as something almost indistinguishable from siblings. The Quiner grandparents, Henry Newton Quiner and Charlotte Louise Tucker Quiner, provided the other half of that shared root system. 4 grandparents, all 4 shared by every child born into the Webb. That is not ordinary kinship. That is something denser, more binding, more permanent than almost anything the frontier had to offer. Laura Ingalls Wilder was born February 7th, 1867, into a Webb that was 6 years old and already being tested by distance. She did not choose the Webb. She arrived inside it, the way you arrive inside a house that was built before you were born, without having chosen the walls, but shaped by them regardless. Now, here is the question that sits underneath everything, quiet and patient, the way important questions always do. If the Webb was built to hold, if 3 marriages in 3 years were the Quiner Ingalls family's answer to a world without hospitals or insurance or any government safety net at all, then where exactly did it hold? And where exactly did it fail to hold? Because the record says both things happened. And the record says they happened in ways that Laura, decades later, writing her books for children, was not going to put on the page. The web held in Wisconsin. When Charles and Caroline Ingalls were still close enough to the other Quiner and Ingalls households that the triple bond could function as it was designed, when a crisis in one home could be answered by hands from another home within a day's travel, the web did exactly what it was built to do. The 1870 census places Charles and Caroline's household in Pepin County, Wisconsin, the territory Laura would eventually write into Little House in the Big Woods as a place of firelit warmth and a father who could handle anything the forest offered. What the census record adds to that picture, without sentimentality, is the surrounding geography of kin. The Ingalls and Quiner family lines were not isolated in this period. They were embedded in a community of related households, a network of people who shared grandparents and surnames, and the particular mutual obligation that comes from knowing your children play together every Sunday and your neighbours are also your family. This is the web functioning. It is not glamorous. It does not look like anything special from the outside. It looks like ordinary neighbourliness, ordinary community life, ordinary frontier settlement. What it is, underneath the ordinary surface, is a precisely designed structure of reciprocal obligation, built from 3 marriages that made strangers into family and made family into something close enough to institutional. But here is what begins to happen in the early 1870s. Charles Ingalls moves, not once, not in a single decision with a clear endpoint in sight. He moves in a way that will come to define his entire adult life, a restlessness so deep and persistent that biographers have wrestled with what to name it. Carolyn Fraser, in her 2017 Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Prairie Fires, documents the pattern with careful detail. Pepin County, Wisconsin, to Montgomery County, Kansas, a brief, legally precarious stay on Osage land that would end in the family being forced out. Back to Wisconsin, then to Walnut Grove in Redwood County, Minnesota, then briefly to Burr Oak, Iowa, then back to Walnut Grove, and finally to De Smet in what would become South Dakota. Each move was its own calculation, its own gamble that the next piece of land was the one that would finally pay. Each move also did something the web's design had not accounted for. It stretched the strands. Every mile Charles put between his household and the other web households was a mile of distance between his family and the people who were supposed to be there when things went wrong. The Quiner family households, the Peter and Eliza Ingalls household, the children of Henry and Polly Quiner, those double first cousins who shared every grandparent with Laura and her sisters, who were genetically as close to Laura as half-siblings, were not moving west at the same pace, in the same direction. The web was designed for geography that no longer existed. And this is where the story gets complicated in the way that real history always gets complicated. Because the Ingalls family's moves were not irrational. They were not the decisions of a man who didn't understand what he was risking. Charles Ingalls understood perfectly well what he was doing. He had a family to feed and land to find, and a particular kind of optimism, stubborn, renewable, deeply American, that told him the next claim was going to be the one that worked. That optimism was not wrong about the possibility. It was wrong about the odds, and what the web could not do, what no kinship alliance, however carefully designed, however triple bonded, however dense with mutual obligation, was protect a family from the internal logic of its own choices about where to go next. The web held between people who stayed close enough to hold it together. For Charles and Caroline's family, the family that moved and kept moving, the web became something different over time. Not broken, exactly. Something more like a memory of a structure that had once been whole. A thing you could still feel when you visited, when you wrote a letter, when you heard news from Wisconsin and felt the particular warmth of knowing those people shared your grandparents, understood your family without explanation. But not a thing you could reach out and touch on the bad days, and the bad days for Charles and Caroline Ingalls were coming. Here is something the Little House books give you, clearly, lovingly, in language a child can hold, and something they quietly choose not to give you alongside it. They give you Pa with his fiddle, Pa who could walk into a blizzard and come back with stories, Pa who built the little house, and then another little house, and then another one, each time with the same cheerful confidence that this one was going to be the one that stayed. What the books do not give you, not in the same breath, not with the same weight, is the documented record of what each of those houses actually cost, not in love. Charles Ingalls had love to spare, not in effort. He worked until his body wore out, in the numbers. Carolyn Fraser's Prairie Fires traces the financial reality of the Ingalls family's frontier years with the kind of specific primary-sourced care that lets you see past the warm amber glow. The Kansas claim had to be abandoned, not just because of Osage land rights, but because the family could not hold it legally and the investment was lost. The Minnesota years brought the grasshopper plagues of 1874 and 1875, which devoured crops so completely that communities across the region were left without food or income for an entire season. The move to Burr Oak, Iowa, is a period Laura barely mentioned in her books, because what it represented was a retreat, a return, a family that had tried and come back with less than they had before. And throughout all of it, through every claim filed and every crop planted and every move made toward the next piece of ground that was supposed to be the one, Charles and Caroline Ingalls were moving further and further from the web that had been built to catch them when these things happened. Stop, because this is the moment to say something carefully. Charles Ingalls was not a failure by the standards of his time or place. He was a capable man, a skilled carpenter documented in multiple sources, a resourceful farmer who did everything the frontier asked of him. The Ingalls family did not collapse. They survived. Laura survived. The children grew up. But there is a difference between surviving and thriving. And there is a difference between a family that survives by calling on the web, those kinship strands designed to catch them, and a family that survives by moving so far from the web that they are, in the hardest years, catching themselves alone. That difference is not in the courage or the character of the people involved, it is in the geography, and the geography was Charles Ingalls' choice to make. Now hold this image because it is going to matter. The Quiner households, Caroline's branch of the family, were not making the same kinds of moves. The Quiner line's documented presence through census records and genealogical research shows a family that stayed closer to its Wisconsin roots, that did not pursue the same kind of repeated westward relocation that defined Charles Ingalls' adult life. That stability, that rootedness, meant the Quiner households retained something that the Ingalls family's moves kept costing them. Proximity to other web households, not wealth. That is not the point here, and that distinction matters. We're not talking about one branch of the family being richer than another. We're talking about something more specific and more consequential on the frontier. We're talking about who was close enough to help. A family that stayed within a day's ride of its web households had something no amount of individual courage could fully replace. Neighbours who were also family and family who were also neighbours. A family that moved 3 times in 4 years had the love of those same people. The letters, the shared memory of grandparents and cousins and childhood Sundays, but not the hands. And on the frontier, hands mattered more than almost anything else. Here is the question you might be sitting with right now. If Laura Ingalls Wilder grew up inside this web, born into it, shaped by it, surrounded by double first cousins who shared all 4 of her grandparents, why does almost none of this show up in the book she eventually wrote? The answer is not simple, but it is honest. And it is one of the most quietly interesting things about how the Little House series works, how memory becomes story, how story becomes myth, and what gets left on the floor when a woman sits down to write her childhood for children who will never know the difference. Horst Zur. Laura began writing what would become the Little House series in the late 1920s, working from a draft manuscript that scholars and historians call the Pioneer Girl manuscript, her original unedited autobiography, which the South Dakota Historical Society Press published in annotated scholarly form in 2014, edited by Pamela Smith Hill. That manuscript is not a children's book. It is not the warm, firelit world of Pa's fiddle and Ma's calm hands and the little houses on successive prairies. It is a more complicated document, longer, franker, less tightly shaped, more willing to mention the relatives and neighbours and family members who populated Laura's actual world. The annotated edition of Pioneer Girl reveals a childhood considerably more saturated with Quiner and Ingalls kin than the published books suggest. The double first cousins, the children of Henry and Polly Quiner, the children of Peter and Eliza Ingalls, are not absent from the record of Laura's life. They appear, named and remembered, in the less filtered manuscript version of her history. They are largely absent from the published series, and this gap, between the family web that the records show and the nuclear family story that the books tell, is not an accident. It is a choice, not a dishonest choice, a narrative choice, made under specific pressures that are worth understanding. The Little House books were conceived and written in the 1930s. Their first publisher, Harper & Brothers, was working with Laura and her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, on books aimed at children, a market with specific expectations about story shape, character count, and emotional simplicity. A children's book in the 1930s was not the place for extended kinship genealogy. It was not the place for a careful explanation of what double first-cousin relationships mean genetically and socially. It was not the place for a frank account of extended family networks and their role in frontier survival. The books that resulted are genuinely beautiful. They are not false. They are true to Laura's emotional experience of her childhood, the love, the movement, the fiddle music, the particular closeness of a family that was almost always, whatever else it lacked, rich in its internal life. What they are not is the whole picture. Johnny Miller, in his biography Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder, published in 1998 by the University of Missouri Press, notes carefully that the published books compressed and simplified Laura's actual experience in ways that were consistent with the demands of children's literature, rather than being attempts at deliberate concealment. The simplification was structural, not conspiratorial. But the structural simplification produced a specific result that matters for what we are doing here. It produced the myth of the isolated nuclear family. The Ingalls alone on the prairie, the Ingalls alone in the big woods, the Ingalls against the weather, the grasshoppers, the long winter, the relentless beautiful difficulty of the frontier. Alone together, just Pa and Ma and the girls, their goodness and their grit, the only thing standing between them and everything the land could throw at them. That is an extraordinary story. It is one of the great American stories. It is also a story from which the web has been carefully removed. Here is something that doesn't get said enough. Removing the web from the story does not just change the story. It changes what the story means. Because a story about a family surviving alone, through courage and virtue and Pa's particular combination of restless optimism and practical skill, is a story about what individuals can do. It is a story that says goodness and hard work are enough. It is a story that says the frontier was fair in the way that matters, and the people who made it on their own terms. A story about a family surviving inside a web, a triple-bonded kinship alliance designed specifically because no nuclear family could safely absorb the full risk of frontier life alone, is a different kind of story. It is a story about what communities can do, about what families build for each other before the emergency arrives, about the specific genius of connecting your household permanently to other households through the most binding social mechanism available, repeated intermarriage between siblings. Both stories are true, but one of them is in the books, and one of them is in the census records and the marriage registers of Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and the genealogical research that maps the Quiner and Ingalls families across 3 consecutive years of deliberate, layered, structurally brilliant alliance building. Pamela Smith Hill, editor of the 2014 annotated Pioneer Girl, has described Laura's manuscripts as evidence of a more complicated family world than the published books suggest. A world populated with relatives, neighbours, and community members who appear briefly and then disappear, trimmed for narrative clarity or simply outgrown by the story Laura chose to tell. The double first cousins are part of that trimming. The children of Henry Quiner and Polly Ingalls, the children of Peter Ingalls and Eliza Quiner. Real people, named in the genealogical record, connected to Laura through bonds so close that modern genetic testing would label them half-siblings, not cousins. They lived, they moved, they scattered, the way the frontier scattered almost everyone eventually, pulling families outward across states and territories, until the geography of kinship became a map of who used to be close, and who was now a day's travel or a week's travel, or simply a name in a letter from somewhere far enough away that it might as well be another world. That scattering is its own chapter in the story of the web, not a collapse, not a failure. Something more like what happens to every carefully built structure when the forces it was designed to resist are larger than the design anticipated. There is a woman who needs to be looked at directly before this chapter closes. Not Laura, not yet. Caroline Quiner Ingalls. Because Caroline is the figure who holds something that the books love her for, but who holds something else that the books never quite hand over to the reader directly. She is Ma, patient, steady, immovable Ma. The dark hair always neatly pinned, the hands always occupied, the voice that doesn't raise even when the situation is plainly catastrophic. She is the emotional anchor of every Little House book. She is the fixed point around which Pa's restless optimism revolves. What Caroline Quiner Ingalls was, before she was Ma, was the second strand of the web. The woman whose marriage to Charles Ingalls, on February 1st, 1860, in Concord, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, when she was 20 years old and he was 24, was the marriage that completed the double bond. Her brother Henry had already married Charles's sister Polly. When Caroline walked to that altar, she was completing a kinship pattern that her family had already begun. She knew exactly what she was doing. Women in 1860 understood family alliance strategy the way women today understand household budgets, in the specific, practical, daily use terms of people who manage the consequences when the strategy works or fails. She was born December 12, 1839 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She was educated by frontier standards to a degree that set her apart. She had attended school, learned to read and cipher, developed a particular care for the interior life of a household that would eventually manifest in the quiet stability she provided across every one of the family's moves, and she made every one of those moves. This is the thing about Caroline Ingalls that the books both capture and don't capture. She moved. Every time Charles decided to move, to Kansas, back to Wisconsin, to Minnesota, to Iowa, back to Minnesota to Dakota, she moved. She packed the wagon, settled the children, unpacked in a new place, and built the interior of a home in whatever structure was available before the season changed. The books give her dignity for this. She deserves it. What the books don't quite give her is the weight of what it cost. Because every move was also a move away from the web, away from the households of Henry and Polly, away from the households of Peter and Eliza, away from the shared grandparent generation, the Ingalls grandparents and the Quiner grandparents, who had been the anchor of a kinship structure designed to last generations. Caroline moved toward the future Charles kept chasing. She moved away from the family web she had been born into and then married into simultaneously, the web that her own mother Charlotte Quiner had watched take shape through 3 careful marriages in 3 years. Binding the Quiners and the Ingalls together in a way that was supposed to hold, it held in Wisconsin, on the prairie, on claim after claim, in the long winters and the hot summers and the years when the crops failed and the money didn't come. Caroline Ingalls held it herself, because the web wasn't there. And here is Charles Philip Ingalls, born January 10, 1836 in Cuba, Allegheny County, New York. The second of the 3 Ingalls siblings who participated in the web, married into the Quiner line, brother of Polly who married out into the Quiner line, brother of Peter who completed the bond with Eliza. He was, by every account that survives, by the consistent portrait that emerges from Laura's writing, from the Pioneer Girl manuscript, from census records and land filings, and the documented pattern of his adult life, a man of genuine gifts and genuine limits. A carpenter good enough that communities in multiple states hired him for construction work when farming didn't pay. A musician who played his fiddle in a way that people decades later still described with something like reverence. A father whose warmth and humour were the emotional centre of his daughters' childhoods. The thing that made the constant movement bearable. The thing that Laura spent 30 years putting on the page because it was the truest thing she knew how to write about him. And a man who filed for homestead claims and filed again and moved again, and left behind in each place some portion of what the family had managed to accumulate, not out of recklessness, not out of incompetence, but out of a particular combination of frontier optimism and frontier misfortune that the records trace with uncomfortable precision. Carolyn Fraser documents, in Prairie Fires, that the Ingalls family's financial history across the frontier years was one of repeated investment and repeated loss. Not catastrophic, single-moment loss, but the slower, grinding kind that comes from crop failures in years of bad weather, from claims that couldn't be held, from debts that required departure before the land could be fully developed. Charles Ingalls was not unlucky in the simple sense. He was a man taking risks on thin margins, in environments that were genuinely unforgiving, without the cushion that comes from starting with more. He started from the web, but the web, as we have seen, was only usable at the distances the web was designed for, and he kept moving. Here is Peter Ingalls, the third Ingalls sibling, the one whose marriage to Eliza Quiner in June 1861 completed the triple bond and made the web whole. Less documented in the popular record than Charles, less known. His name appears in the genealogical research, in the census records, in the scholarly notes of the Pioneer Girl annotated edition. But not in the books, not in the television adaptation, not in the warm cultural memory that the Little House series created. He is in a sense the web's most invisible member, the third strand, the one whose marriage locked the structure into its final shape, and whose relative obscurity in the historical narrative is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that the web's full architecture has always been easier to feel than to see. Peter and Eliza's children were Laura's double first cousins. The same genetic closeness, roughly 25% shared DNA, equivalent to half-siblings, that the children of Henry and Polly shared with Laura. Real people, with real names, with a real relationship to a woman who would one day write the most beloved American frontier books in history, without ever quite putting them on the page. That omission is not a betrayal. It is the gap between a life and a story, between what you lived and what you chose to tell, between a family web that held you through the early years and a narrative that, for the purposes of the books that needed to be written, was simpler and more powerful and more true in the specific way that childhood memory is true. Not as a census record is true, but as a feeling is true. And here is what we are left with. 2 ledger books open on the same table. One is labelled with the dates and the names and the precise county records. Jefferson County, Wisconsin, February 1859, February 1st, 1860, June 1861. The hard documented evidence of what the Quiner Ingalls families built across 28 months. The triple bond, the web. The genetic architecture that made Laura Ingalls Wilder's cousins as close to her as half-siblings. That made 4 grandparents shared across 3 households. That made the frontier survivable in theory by distributing its risks across a structure no single nuclear family could have supported alone. The other ledger is the one Laura kept, not in numbers, in images, in the smell of tobacco and wood smoke that meant Pa was home, in the sound of a fiddle in a house that had almost nothing else, in the patient dignity of Ma's hands moving through work that never ended, and in the prairie that stretched so wide and so open that a child growing up inside it could believe very easily that her family was alone in it, alone and sufficient and brave enough for everything the world could ask. Both ledgers are true. The question, and it is the question this chapter leaves you with, sitting quietly at the edge of everything that comes next, is not which one is truer. The question is what we lose when we only read one of them. Because the web was real. Henry Quiner married Polly Ingalls, Caroline Quiner married Charles Ingalls, Eliza Quiner married Peter Ingalls. 3 weddings, 28 months. 2 family trees woven into one structure so dense that the children it produced shared every grandparent they had. That web held in Wisconsin. It held in the years when geography allowed it to function as it was designed. It stretched when Charles moved west and kept stretching, and eventually became something held more by memory and letter, and the particular warmth of kinship that doesn't fully disappear just because the miles increase. Laura was born into it. She was shaped by it. And when she sat down, decades later, to write the story of her childhood, to find the true thing inside the memory and put it on the page for children who would carry it with them for the rest of their lives, she wrote the family she remembered feeling. Not the family the census records. And maybe that is exactly right. Maybe the web was always meant to be felt rather than counted. Maybe what the triple bond built in its deepest function was not just a survival mechanism, but a sense. Carried in the body, in the voice, in the way you recognize certain faces because those faces share your grandparents, of not being alone. Laura Ingalls Wilder was never alone in the way the books make her seem. The web made sure of that, even when the web was too far away to hold. She was 90 years old when she died, February 10th, 1957. Rocky Ridge Farm, Mansfield, Missouri, 3 days after her 90th birthday. And here is the thing about that, the thing that sits quietly underneath the date and the farmhouse name, and the clean biographical fact of it. Laura Ingalls Wilder died in a house she owned outright, on land she'd worked for decades with Almanzo beside her, in a home that had bookshelves and a kitchen with real floors and grandchildren who came to visit, and readers by the tens of millions who had grown up on her words and still wrote her letters that arrived in stacks and had to be answered one by one. She died comfortable. She died known. She died in a place that held. And somewhere inside the distance between where she was born, a log cabin in Pepin County, Wisconsin, inside a web her family had spent 28 months constructing, so that no single household would face the frontier alone, and where she died, there is the entire story we've been sitting with this whole time. Not just about a woman, not just about a family, about what gets built, what gets written down, and what gets quietly left out of both. There is a particular kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a funeral or a fire or a clear moment you can point to and say, that is when it ended. It arrives slowly, the way geography separates people who never decided to be separated. Miles accumulate, seasons pass, letters get written less often, and then not at all, and the cousins who shared your grandparents, who were genetically as close to you as half-siblings, who grew up in households that were supposed to mirror yours, built by the same deliberate marriage logic that fused two families into one permanent alliance. Those cousins become faces you remember more clearly than you can actually picture. That is what happened to the double first cousin generation, not all at once, and not because anyone stopped caring, because the frontier was bigger than the web. Laura's double first cousins were real people with real lives that the historical record touches in pieces, in census entries, in vital records, in the genealogical research that platforms like FamilySearch and Ancestry.com have made available to anyone willing to look carefully. The children of Henry Quiner and Polly Ingalls, the children of Peter Ingalls and Eliza Quiner. People who shared all four of Laura's grandparents, Lansford and Laura Colby Ingalls on one side, Henry Newton Quiner and Charlotte Tucker Quiner on the other, and who therefore carried, in their bodies, a genetic signature as close to Laura's as a half-siblings. They were not fictional. They were not background figures in a story about someone else. They were the living proof that the web had worked exactly as designed. And what happened to them is what happens to almost everyone the frontier touches eventually. They scattered. But the centrifugal force of 19th century American westward movement was not gentle with family webs, no matter how carefully those webs had been constructed. The same restless optimism that pulled Charles Ingalls from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Dakota pulled other families in other directions, south, northwest, further into territories that were still being named and organized and fought over. The Homestead Act of 1862, signed into law just 1 year after Peter and Eliza completed the triple bond in June 1861, did not slow the scattering. It accelerated it. It handed 160 acres to anyone willing to stake a claim and hold it for 5 years, and it sent a generation of young men who might otherwise have stayed close to the kinship webs their parents had built, out onto the open plains to see if the land could be made to pay. Some of them came back, most of them didn't. The double first cousin generation, the children the web was specifically designed to protect, the generation whose shared grandparents were supposed to make them something closer than ordinary family, grew up and dispersed in the way that generation dispersed. Not because the web had failed, because the web had done its job. It had given them a childhood inside a structure of mutual support. It had given them the Wisconsin years, the years when geography and kinship were still aligned, when the Quiner and Ingalls households could function as the distributed survival network they were designed to be. After that, the children were on their own, and the web became memory. Now here is the question that stays with you once you've seen this clearly. If the web was documented, if the marriages were recorded in Jefferson County registers, if the census data tracked the 3 Ingalls Quiner households through 1860 and 1870, if the children of those 3 households could be identified through genealogical research with reasonable confidence, then why did it take so long for the general public to understand what Laura Ingalls Wilder's family actually looked like? Why did the myth of the isolated nuclear family hold for so long? The answer is not a mystery, but it is worth sitting with, because it tells you something true about how stories work and how history works, and how those two things are not always the same. The Little House books were published between 1932 and 1943. They were written by a woman in her 60s and 70s who was drawing from memory and from an earlier draft manuscript, the pioneer girl autobiography she had written in the late 1920s, but who was also very deliberately writing for children. Harper & Brothers was publishing books for young readers. The market had specific expectations. The story had to move, had to centre on a small, clear cast of characters, had to give children a protagonist they could follow without getting lost in a genealogical thicket of cousins and double cousins and sisters-in-law who had already married each other's brothers. The web was real. But the web was not a children's book. So what made it onto the page, the Charles and Caroline household, the girls, the fiddle, the warmth and the difficulty of a family moving and surviving together, was true. Genuinely, emotionally, historically true in the sense that memory is true. What didn't make it onto the page was the architecture underneath. The 3 marriages, the shared grandparents, the double first cousins who were, in the biological sense that modern genetics can now measure precisely, as close to Laura as half-siblings. That architecture stayed in the records. Waiting. Yet for decades it mostly stayed there. The 1974 television series, which ran on NBC until 1983 and introduced the Little House world to a generation who had not read the books, or who had read them in childhood and now watched their children watch Michael Landon inhabit a version of Pa that was warmer and more present and perhaps more reliable than the historical Charles Ingalls, made the isolation more complete, not less. The television Ingalls family was a nuclear unit in a way that felt modern, even while it looked historical. Self-contained, self-sufficient, their virtues internal rather than structural, their survival a matter of character rather than kinship strategy. The double cousin web was not a television subplot. It didn't make the pilot, or the finale, or any episode in between. The version of the Little House world that reached the widest audience, that shaped what tens of millions of Americans understood when they heard the name Laura Ingalls Wilder, was a version from which the web had been removed so cleanly that most viewers never knew it had existed. That is not an accusation. Television adaptation makes choices the same way memoir makes choices. You tell the story that fits the frame you have, but here is what it produced. It produced a public understanding of the Ingalls family as the American frontier family, the template, the archetype, the proof that individual virtue and hard work and a loving nuclear unit were sufficient for survival on the American prairie. And that understanding was only half true. The other half was in the county records. It was in the Jefferson County, Wisconsin marriage registers, where Henry Quiner and Polly Ingalls signed their names in February 1859. It was in the 1860 census, where you could find, if you looked carefully, 3 Ingalls-Quiner households in the same geographic area. It was in the genealogical databases that patient researchers had been building for decades, cross-referencing birth records and death records and census entries and vital registrations until the pattern became impossible to miss. 2 families, 3 marriages, 28 months. The web was always there. It was never hidden, not in the sense of being concealed. It was hiding in plain sight in the way that things hide when no one is looking for them because the story everyone already knows doesn't leave room for them. And then something happened that changed the looking. In 2014, the South Dakota Historical Society Press published Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, edited by Pamela Smith Hill. It was not a casual publication. It was a scholarly edition, dense with footnotes, cross-referenced against census records and vital documents, constructed by a historian who had spent years tracing every name and date and location that Laura mentioned in her original unedited memoir against the primary sources that could confirm or complicate them. What the annotated Pioneer Girl did, what it did that nothing else had done with quite the same rigour or the same accessibility, was lay the actual family world of Laura Ingalls Wilder next to the literary world of the Little House books and let readers see the gap. Not to accuse, not to debunk, to show the relatives who appear in Pioneer Girl and not in the published books, the cousins named in passing. The family structure visible in the background of Laura's memories, a background more populated, more interconnected, more explicitly kin-saturated than anything the series had made room for. The web was in there, not announced as such, not labelled, but traceable for anyone who followed the names and the dates back to their sources, back to Jefferson County, back to 1859 and 1860 and June of 1861. And here is what the 2014 publication did to the genealogical community. It lit something up. The Little House genealogical research world, which had existed for years in the form of dedicated family historians, regional historical societies, and online communities built around the Little House Heritage Trust and related organisations, suddenly had a major scholarly anchor, a peer-reviewed, footnoted, primary-sourced anchor that validated what many researchers had already suspected, that the published books were not the full record, and that the full record contained a family structure considerably denser, more interconnected, and more strategically coherent than the books had suggested. The triple marriage sequence, already visible to anyone who had traced the Quiner and Ingalls family lines through census records, came into sharper focus in that context. Not because the Pioneer Girl annotations explicitly labelled it as a strategic kinship alliance, but because the annotations put enough of the pieces in one place that researchers could assemble them. Henry Quiner and Polly Ingalls, February 1859, Charles Ingalls and Caroline Quiner, February 1860, Peter Ingalls and Eliza Quiner, June 1861, 3 entries, 3 dates, 2 family trees that became one. Now hold something alongside that. In roughly the same years that Pioneer Girl was published, and the genealogical research community was sharpening its focus on the Quiner-Ingalls structure, something else was happening in American living rooms and on American laptops that had nothing to do with Laura Ingalls Wilder specifically, but had everything to do with why this story lands differently now than it would have landed in 1990s. Consumer DNA testing became mainstream. Ancestry DNA launched its testing service in 2012. 23andMe had been building its database since 2007. By the mid-2010s, millions of Americans were spitting into tubes and mailing them off, and waiting for results that arrived as percentage breakdowns and ethnicity estimates, and, most significantly for this story, match lists, lists of genetic relatives, organised by estimated relationship, that sometimes contained names people expected and sometimes contained names that made no sense until you went looking for the genealogical reason. And somewhere in those match lists, regularly, predictably, confusingly, were double first cousins. The double first cousin discovery is one of the most reliably disorienting experiences in consumer DNA testing, according to the genealogical research communities that have documented it extensively. It looks wrong. The percentage is too high for what the family tree says. The platform's estimated relationship says half-sibling, or close family, possible half-sibling. The person on the other end of the match is someone you've known your whole life as a cousin. Your parents are first cousins, the family has always said so, and now the algorithm is telling you that you share 25% of your DNA, not 12.5. It feels like a secret. It feels like something was hidden. Most of the time, nothing was hidden. The math is simply doing what the math does when 2 siblings in one family married 2 siblings in another family. The coefficient of relationship for double first cousins is 25%, the same as half-siblings, the same as a grandparent and grandchild. Perfectly explainable once you know what to look for and almost completely invisible until you do. For most people encountering this for the first time, the explanation takes research. A phone call to an elderly aunt, a dig through old family Bibles and marriage certificates, a late night on Ancestry.com tracing lines back through names you half remember from childhood, until you find the 2 marriages, the ones that happened in the same family in the same generation, that made your cousin read as something much closer than a cousin, and when they find it, they almost always say the same thing. Why didn't anyone tell us? It was because nobody thought to, because the word for it, double first cousin, was not part of ordinary family vocabulary. Because in the 19th century, when these marriages were happening regularly in frontier communities across America, families didn't need the technical term. They just knew. They knew the Quiners and the Ingalls had intermarried 3 times, in 3 years. They knew the children of those marriages were something tighter than ordinary cousins, something that didn't require a genetic explanation, because it was lived every day in the proximity of shared grandparents, and shared Sunday dinners, and shared knowledge of the same family stories from the same mouths. The term became necessary only when the living memory disappeared. Only when the grandparents who held both sides of the web in their heads at the same time were gone, and the next generation had only the family tree on paper, and the generation after that had only the DNA percentage on a screen, and suddenly the percentage didn't match the tree and nobody could explain why. That gap between what the living web knew and what the written record preserved is its own kind of loss. Quiet, bloodless. The loss of context that happens when people die and take the felt knowledge of relationships with them, leaving only documents behind. Yeah, what the documents say, read carefully together, is this. In February 1859, two families who had been neighbours long enough to trust each other made the decision, whether gradually and naturally or at least partially with intent, to formalise that trust in the most permanent way their world recognised. They exchanged siblings. Henry Quiner took Polly Ingalls, and the door opened. A year later, Charles Ingalls walked Caroline Quiner to an altar in Jefferson County and sealed a second strand. And then 18 months after that, Peter Ingalls married Eliza Quiner, and the third strand closed, and the web was whole. 4 grandparents shared across 3 households. Genetic closeness between the children equivalent to half-siblings, measurable today by any consumer DNA kit, and explainable in about 4 minutes to anyone who has ever wondered why their cousin shows up as something closer than a cousin. That is what the documents say. What they can't say, what no document can say, is what it felt like to be Laura Ingalls Wilder and to grow up inside that web in the years when the web was still geographically intact, to be surrounded by cousins who were genetically half-siblings, to have grandparents who were, unusually, universally shared, to move through a childhood in which the word family meant something denser and more layered than the nuclear unit the books would eventually describe. For that, you have to read the Pioneer Girl manuscript, not for what it says explicitly, for what it reveals in the texture of the names it mentions, the relatives it assumes the reader will recognise, the family world it describes as though its complexity needs no explanation, because it was simply the world. Laura Wilder, she took the name Laura Ingalls Wilder when she married Almanzo in August of 1885 in De Smet, Dakota Territory, spent the last decades of her life at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. Rocky Ridge is worth stopping on for a moment, because it is the place where several things converge that this documentary has been circling since the beginning. She and Almanzo bought the land in 1894, 100 acres of Ozark Hill country that was, by most accounts, not immediately promising. Almanzo had suffered a stroke from a bout of diphtheria in 1888 that left his legs permanently weakened. The couple had lost a son in infancy. A fire had destroyed an earlier home. They arrived in Missouri with what they had, which was not much, and they began again. Over the following decades, they built Rocky Ridge into something that held. Not through a kinship web, not through the triple-bonded alliance structure that the Quiner Ingalls families had built in Wisconsin 30 years before, through sheer sustained work in a place they chose and stayed in, through the particular kind of rootedness that comes not from where you were born, but from where you stop. And it was at Rocky Ridge, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, that Laura began writing. First the Pioneer Girl manuscript, the raw, frank, longer, more complicated version of her own life, written for an adult readership that never materialized in that form. Then, with guidance from her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, and with the editorial hand of Harper and Brothers, the series of 8 books that would eventually reach readers in more than 40 languages and remain in print continuously for nearly a century, the books that left the web out. There is a question worth asking about that choice, and it is not a critical question, it is a curious one. When Laura sat down in her Ozark farmhouse in the late 1920s to write what she remembered of her childhood, she was a woman in her early 60s. The web's anchor generation, the grandparents, the Charlotte Quiners and the Lansford Ingalls, who had been the shared roots of the double first cousin world, were long dead. The double first cousins themselves were elderly or gone. The households that had clustered in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in the years between 1859 and 1861, fused into one complex family by 3 precise marriages, had long since scattered across the map. What Laura had left of the web was memory. And memory, as any honest person who has tried to write their own history will tell you, does not preserve structures. It preserves feelings. It preserves the warmth of a particular kind of belonging without always preserving the mechanism that created it. Laura remembered being part of something larger than her immediate household. She remembered the cousins, the aunts and uncles who were doubles, aunt on both sides, uncle on both sides, the particular density of a childhood inside a world where everyone you encountered in the family circle was family in more ways than one. But by the time she sat down to write, The mechanism that had created that density was 30, 40, 50 years in the past. And the mechanism, 3 marriages, 2 families, 28 months, was not the story she was writing. The story she was writing was a girl's story, a child moving through a world of extraordinary beauty and difficulty, shaped by a father who played the fiddle and a mother whose steadiness was its own form of grace. The web was the frame. The story was what was inside the frame, and when you write for children, you write the inside. But here is what you lose when you leave the frame out. You lose the understanding that this family was not alone in the way the books make them seem. You lose the understanding that the survival they achieved, real survival, hard-won, across grasshopper plagues and failed claims and long winters, and the particular grinding financial difficulty that Caroline Fraser documented in Prairie Fires with primary-sourced precision, was survival that happened inside a designed structure. A structure that worked when the geography permitted it, and strained when the geography worked against it, and survived in the form of memory and shared identity long after the miles had made it functionally impossible. You lose the understanding that the American frontier was not, in its most honest form, a story about individuals. It was a story about what individuals built with each other before the emergency arrived. The agreements made in advance, the marriages that were also contracts, the kinship webs that distributed risk across multiple households, so that when one household faltered, and on the frontier faltering was not exceptional, it was scheduled, there was something other than empty air beneath it. The Little House books are one of the great American stories. That is not in question. They gave generations of children something real, a model of resilience, of family love, of the particular courage it takes to keep building after the thing you built falls down. What they gave silently, without naming it, was the web. The web is in the books. You can feel it in the warmth of the family world Laura describes, in the sense that the Ingalls household always had an interior richness that didn't quite match its exterior poverty, in the feeling that this family was held by something more than its own individual courage. You just can't see the web from the inside of a children's book. You have to go back to the records. And that is what this story has been doing all along, going back to Jefferson County, going back to February 1859, when Henry Quiner and Polly Ingalls stood together and started something that neither of them probably thought of as starting something. They thought of it as marrying, as making a life, as doing what people in their position and their time and their geography did, when they found someone from a good family who was also from a familiar family and who was available and willing. But what they started was a web, and 1 year later, when Charles and Caroline added the second strand, the web became something with real structure, a design you could feel even if you couldn't name it. And 18 months after that, when Peter and Eliza completed the third strand, the web was whole. 4 grandparents, 3 households, a generation of children who would grow up as genetic half-siblings labelled as cousins. And one of those children, born February 7th, 1867, 6 years after the web was finished, who would eventually write 8 books about her childhood and sell them in 40 languages and make the Little House world one of the most recognised American stories in the history of publishing, without ever quite putting the web on the page. So, here is what we are left with. 2 ledger books, not the Wilder ledger and the Ingalls ledger from before. This is a different set. These are the ledgers that the entire documentary has been building toward. The first ledger is the one the records keep. County marriage registers, census data, genealogical databases, the Pioneer Girl annotations that Pamela Smith Hill spent years assembling. The DNA percentage that a descendant of Henry and Polly Quiner gets back from Ancestry DNA today, the one that reads 25% shared DNA with a person they've always known as a distant cousin, and that the algorithm flags as something closer, close enough to make you stop and look again and go searching for the answer in the records where the answer has always been. This ledger says, 2 families made 3 marriages in 28 months. The resulting kinship structure was not accidental. The children it produced were not ordinary cousins. The web was real, and it was built deliberately, and it functioned as a survival mechanism during the years when the geography allowed it, and it scattered, not broke, scattered, when the frontier pulled the families apart in different directions. This ledger is precise. It deals in dates and DNA percentages and the documented locations of 3 households across multiple census years. It does not sentimentalize. It records. The second ledger is the one Laura kept. Not in numbers, never in numbers. In the smell of the cabin in winter when Pa came home with venison and set his rifle against the wall and picked up his fiddle before he even took off his coat, because the music was the thing that said everything was all right again. In the sound of Ma's voice, steady and precise, moving through the daily architecture of a household that had almost nothing and somehow managed to feel like enough. In the particular quality of light on a Dakota prairie in summer, when the grass went on so far in every direction that you could almost believe the world had no edges. This ledger does not have a line for the web. It has a feeling for it. The warmth of belonging to something larger than yourself. The sense of being held. The particular safety of a childhood that was difficult and rich at the same time. Laura left the mechanism out because the mechanism was not what she remembered feeling. She remembered the feeling, and the feeling, translated into language a child could hold, became the Little House books. The mechanism stayed in the records, and the records have been patient. Now, here is the thing that no one ever says clearly at the end of a story like this. The web did not disappear when Laura died at Rocky Ridge Farm on February 10th, 1957. It did not disappear when the double first cousin generations scattered across the map. It did not disappear when the Little House books compressed the family world into a nuclear unit and handed it to 40 languages and 100 years of readers who grew up believing the Ingalls faced the frontier alone. The web is still in the records. It is still in the Jefferson County marriage registers, still in the 1860 census, still in the genealogical databases where the descendants of Henry Quiner and Polly Ingalls and the descendants of Peter Ingalls and Eliza Quiner sit waiting to be connected to each other by anyone who looks carefully enough and asks the right questions. And it is still in the DNA. Every person alive today who descends from any of the 3 Quiner Ingalls households carries, in the precise molecular language of genetics, the evidence of what their ancestors built in Wisconsin between 1859 and 1861. The web is not a metaphor for those people. It is a measurable biological fact, a 25% match that shows up on a screen and makes them stop and go searching for the explanation that has been sitting in the records for 160 years. That is what a web does when it is built well. It holds longer than the people who made it. Longer than the Wisconsin winters they designed it to survive. Longer than the frontier that scattered their children in every direction. Longer than the books that told the story without naming the structure underneath. Longer than the television adaptation that gave the story to millions of viewers who never knew the web existed. Longer than Laura herself, who lived inside the web as a child and wrote about something true and left the blueprint for something true and died at 90, with both things intact. The story she had told and the story the records were still keeping. The barn stayed full for the people who had a barn. The cellar went thin for the family that moved too far from the web to be caught when the winter came. The ledger recorded both, and the risk, the frontier risk, the choice made on thin margins with no cushion beneath them, the choice that looks like grit when it works and looks like something else when it doesn't. The risk was never the same for every family that faced it. Some families built webs. Some families built webs and then moved so far from them that the web became a memory of warmth rather than a functioning safety net. And one family built a web and moved and came through and wrote 8 books about the coming through, books that gave the world something genuinely beautiful and genuinely true, while the web waited in the records, intact, patient, 25% shared DNA in a database, 3 golden strands between 2 family trees in a Wisconsin County register, holding exactly what it was built to hold, the story, even when the story forgot to look for it,